On a crisp autumn evening in Manhattan, the city pulsed with its usual rhythm. Honking cabs, distant sirens, the hum of ambition echoing off glass towers. High above it all, on the 52nd floor of a sleek midtown skyscraper, golden light spilled from floor-to-ceiling windows of a penthouse that cost more than most people would earn in 10 lifetimes. Inside, crystal chandeliers shimmered, champagne flutes clinked, and laughter floated like perfume through rooms filled with art worth more than houses. It was the kind of party where everyone knew exactly how much everything cost, including each other's reputations. The host, a man whose name appeared regularly on magazine covers and tech conference stages, stood near the grand piano in the main salon, holding court with investors and influencers. He wore a tailored suit that probably cost more than a used car, but his smile was easy. Practiced, the kind that said, "I own the room, but you're welcome to admire it." Beside him, his fiancée, sharp-eyed, effortlessly elegant, held a glass of vintage rosé and surveyed the crowd like a queen reviewing her court. She'd just made a joke that landed perfectly. "If anyone here can actually play Chopin's Ballad No. 1 on that piano," she said, nodding toward the gleaming black Steinway in the corner, "I'll marry them instead." The group laughed, not because they believed it, but because the piano hadn't been touched in years. It was there for show, like the abstract sculpture in the hallway or the rare orchids flown in weekly from Costa Rica. No one expected anyone to take her seriously, especially not the man in the gray maintenance uniform who slipped through the service entrance a few minutes earlier, toolbox in hand. He moved quietly, almost invisibly, checking thermostats and air vents with the calm efficiency of someone who'd done this job for decades. His name wasn't on the guest list, and no one greeted him. To the glittering crowd, he was part of the building's infrastructure, like the lights or the elevator, present only when needed, otherwise ignored. But he heard the bet. He paused near the piano, pretending to inspect a vent beneath it, though his eyes lingered on the keys. They were clean, polished, untouched. He hadn't seen a real grand piano up close in over 30 years, not since the days when his fingers flew across them like birds in flight, when concert halls held their breath for his entrance. Back then, people leaned forward in their seats just to hear him breathe between notes. Now, he breathed quietly in the background, unnoticed. Someone noticed him lingering, though. A young woman in a sequined dress wrinkled her nose. "Hey, aren't you supposed to be downstairs?" she asked, voice edged with polite condescension. He didn't look up. "Just finishing my rounds, ma'am," he said softly, voice rough but calm. The host overheard and chuckled. Let him be. He's probably never even seen a piano like this. That's when the fiancée turned, her eyes landing on him. She didn't sneer, she was too polished for that. But there was a flicker of amusement, as if the idea of this man attempting Chopin was the evening's best punchline. "Go ahead," she said, raising her glass slightly. "If you can play it, I'll keep my word." A ripple of nervous laughter spread. It was clearly a joke, but in that room, jokes often had stakes. And something in the way she said it, half challenge, half dare, made the air shift. The man hesitated. He hadn't played in public since the accident, the one that changed everything. Since the hospital bills swallowed his future, since he traded concert gowns for coveralls, since the world forgot his name. But music never left him. It lived in his bones, in the way he tapped rhythms on steering wheels, in the lullabies he hummed to his nephew when he babysat. He missed it like a limb. He set his toolbox down gently, walked to the piano, lifted the fallboard. The wood was cool under his palms. He sat, the room went still. Not out of respect, out of curiosity, maybe even pity. A few guests pulled out phones. Someone whispered, "This is going to be painful." He placed his hands on the keys. They were calloused from years of scrubbing floors and fixing pipes, but they remembered. They always remembered, and then he played. It didn't start loud or flashy. Just a single note, held with such tenderness it seemed to hang in the air like a question. Then another, and another. Within seconds, the opening melody of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 unfurled, not as a performance, but as a confession. His fingers moved with a quiet authority, weaving sorrow and hope into every phrase. The tempo was perfect, the dynamics alive, soft when the music ached, powerful when it surged. He wasn't showing off. He was telling a story only he could tell, of loss, of silence, of beauty that survives even when buried. People stopped smirking. The investor checking his watch lowered it. The influencer filming for her story forgot to narrate. Even the host, who'd been mid-sentence about market trends, stood frozen, glass halfway to his lips. By the time he reached the stormy climax, the cascading arpeggios that demand both technical mastery and emotional courage, the room was utterly silent, except for the music. And when the final chord rang out, pure and resonant, hanging in the air like a held breath, no one moved for a long moment. Then, from the back, a single pair of hands began to clap. Then another. Soon the whole room was applauding, not the polite golf clap of a charity gala, but real, stunned, emotional applause. Some people had tears in their eyes. The fiancée stood motionless, her glass forgotten, her expression unreadable. But the man didn't bow, didn't smile. He simply closed the piano lid, stood, picked up his toolbox, and walked out the way he came in, through the service door, down the freight elevator, back into the world that had long since stopped expecting anything from him. Outside, the city roared on, unaware of what had just happened 52 floors above. But inside that penthouse, nothing would ever feel quite the same. Because for the first time in years, the most expensive object in the room, the piano, had finally been seen not as decoration, but as a voice. And the quietest man in the room had spoken louder than anyone ever expected. The silence after the final note didn't last long, but it felt like forever. In that suspended moment, something shifted in the room. It wasn't just the music. It was the way the air changed, how people stood a little straighter, how even the clinking of ice in glasses seemed too loud. No one knew what to say. The man in the gray uniform had already turned away, walking calmly toward the service door as if he'd just fixed a leaky faucet, not shattered every assumption in the room. But the spell he left behind wouldn't break so easily. At first, the guests tried to laugh it off. Must have been a fluke, someone muttered. Maybe he used to be a teacher or something. But the truth was written on their faces. Wide eyes, slack jaws, the kind of stunned quiet that only comes when you've witnessed something real. Not staged, not polished for social media. Just raw, unfiltered talent rising from a place no one expected. One guest, a teenager visiting with her aunt, had filmed the whole thing on her phone without thinking. She didn't plan to post it. She just couldn't believe what she was seeing. Later that night, curled up in bed, she watched it again. Then again. By morning, she'd shared it with a friend. That friend sent it to a group chat. By noon, the clip had jumped from private messages to a local music forum. By evening, it was everywhere. The video didn't have a title at first, just shaky footage, slightly out of focus with muffled audio. But you could still hear it. The depth of each note, the way the melody swelled like a heartbeat. And you could see him, shoulders slightly hunched, face calm, eyes fixed on the keys like they were the only thing in the world that mattered. No grand gestures, no showy bows. Just a man playing like his life depended on it. People started asking, who was he? Where did he come from? Why was he wearing a janitor's uniform at a billionaire's party? The host of the party, still reeling, tried to downplay it at first. He's part of the building staff, he told reporters who called. Nice guy. Didn't know he played. But even he couldn't ignore the buzz. His social media exploded. Some praised him for giving the man a chance. Others accused him of exploiting the moment. Most just wanted to know more about the pianist. Meanwhile, the man himself had no idea any of this was happening. He'd gone home to his small apartment in the Bronx, made a simple dinner of beans and rice, and sat by the window listening to the distant wail of sirens. He'd played that piece once a year, every year, on the anniversary of his brother's accident. It was his way of remembering, of saying, I'm still here, and I haven't forgotten you. He never imagined anyone would hear it, especially not in a room full of strangers who saw him as invisible. But now, the world was looking. A local news station tracked him down through the building management. They showed up at his door with cameras and microphones. He opened it just a crack, wary. I don't want trouble, he said. No trouble, the reporter assured him gently. We just want to understand. That performance, it moved a lot of people. He hesitated. Then slowly he let them in, not for fame, but because maybe, just maybe, someone would finally understand why music mattered so much to him. Over weak tea in his tidy living room, he spoke softly about his past. Not in grand terms, not with drama, but with the quiet ache of someone who'd carried a heavy truth for decades. He'd studied at one of the top music schools in the country. Teachers called him a once-in-a-generation talent. He practiced 10 hours a day, slept with sheet music under his pillow, dreamed of concert halls from Vienna to Tokyo. Then, one rainy night, everything changed. His younger brother, a bright kid with plans to be an engineer, was hit by a car while walking home from work. The driver sped off. No insurance, no savings, just hospital bills piling up like storm clouds. He dropped out the next week, sold his piano, took the first job he could find, night custodian at a downtown office building. He told no one, not out of shame, but because grief doesn't need an audience. For years, he played in secret, on broken keyboards in thrift stores, on church pianos after hours. Sometimes he'd sit at a bench in a public park and press imaginary keys with his fingers, running through sonatas in his head. Music became his private language, the only place he could still be whole. Back at the penthouse, the billionaire host couldn't stop thinking about the performance. He replayed the video over and over, not as entertainment, but as a mirror. He'd built an empire on innovation, on seeing potential where others didn't. Yet, he'd looked right through the man who'd just played one of the most difficult pieces in the classical repertoire with more soul than any concert pianist he'd ever paid to entertain his guests, he called his fiancée.
"Do you think he meant to do that?"
he asked. "I don't know," she said quietly, "but I think we owe him more than a joke." She hadn't slept well since the party. The bet had been careless, thoughtless, a throwaway line meant to amuse, but now it felt like a wound. She had reduced something sacred to a punchline, and the man had answered not with anger but with grace. That haunted her more than any scandal ever could. Meanwhile, musicians began reacting online. A retired concert pianist posted a tearful response. That wasn't just skill. That was lived experience. You can't fake that kind of depth. A young composer wrote, he played like he had nothing to lose and everything to say. The video hit 1 million views. Then 5, then 10, but the man didn't check his phone. He didn't know his face was on news sites, that strangers were calling him a hidden genius, that people were starting petitions to get him a real piano. He went to work the next day like always, mopping floors, emptying trash bins, fixing flickering lights. Only now the doorman nodded with new respect. The security guard smiled when he passed. One woman left a handwritten note on his cart. "Thank you for reminding us that beauty hides in plain sight." He read it, folded it carefully, and tucked it into his wallet. That night, alone again, he sat on the edge of his bed and stared at his hands. They were rough, scarred from years of labor, but they still remembered every scale, every chord, every silence between notes. And for the first time in a long time, he wondered, maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe music didn't have to stay hidden. He didn't know what would come next. But somewhere, deep down, a door he'd locked decades ago had creaked open, just a little. And through the crack, light was starting to get in. The video kept spreading, not with flashy edits or viral hashtags, but the quiet kind of sharing that happens when something touches people in a real way. A music teacher showed it to her students. A veteran played it for his therapy group. A grandmother in Ohio sent it to her grandson with a note. This is what real talent looks like. It wasn't about fame. It was about feeling seen. But for the man who'd played the piano, the attention felt like standing in a storm with no shelter. Reporters camped outside his building. Strangers slid notes under his door. One woman even showed up with a bouquet of flowers and a second-hand keyboard saying, "Please keep playing." He thanked her politely, but didn't invite her in. He wasn't used to being the center of anything, least of all hope. Still, the past wouldn't stay buried. One afternoon, while he was restocking paper towels in a downtown office, an older woman stopped in the hallway. She squinted at him, then gasped softly. "Is it really you?" she asked, voice trembling. He didn't recognize her at first, until she said his student number from Juilliard. She'd been a teaching assistant back then, decades ago, and remembered him as the quiet kid who stayed late to practice long after everyone else had gone home. "You disappeared," she said. We all wondered what happened. He looked down at his worn shoes. "Life happened," he said simply. She didn't push. Just handed him a folded piece of paper, her contact info, and said, "If you ever want to talk or play, my door's open." That night he dug out an old shoebox from the back of his closet. Inside were yellowed programs from student recitals, a cracked metronome, and a single black and white photo of him and his brother, arms slung over each other's shoulders. grinning like the future was guaranteed. He traced the edge of the photo with his thumb. His brother had loved music too, not to play, but to listen. He'd sit on the floor of their tiny apartment, eyes closed, while his older brother practiced. "You make the piano talk," he used to say. After the accident, the silence was unbearable. Not just the absence of his brother's laugh, but the absence of music itself. For months, he couldn't even look at a piano without feeling like he was betraying him. Like joy was a luxury he no longer deserved. So he buried it. Buried the dream, the training, the name people once whispered with awe. Became someone else entirely, reliable, invisible, safe. But that night in the penthouse, something broke open. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a crack in the dam he'd built around his heart. And now memories were leaking through. He started dreaming in melodies again, waking up with phrases from Beethoven or Rachmaninoff humming in his mind. He'd catch himself tapping rhythms on the steering wheel, on grocery bags, on his knee during the bus ride to work. The music was coming back, not as a ghost, but as a companion. Then came the call. Not from a news station or a talent scout, but from someone who remembered him before the world forgot. A former professor, now retired, living upstate, had seen the video. At first, he didn't believe it was the same student, but then he heard the phrasing in the left hand, the way the melody breathed. It was unmistakable. He left a voicemail, voice thick with emotion. "If you're willing, I'd be honored to hear you play again." No audience, no pressure, just two old friends and a piano. The man listened to the message 3 times, then he called back. They met a week later in a sunlit living room filled with books and the faint scent of pipe tobacco. In the corner sat a well-loved upright piano, its wood scratched but warm. The professor didn't say much, just poured 2 cups of tea, sat in a worn armchair and nodded toward the bench. He hesitated only a moment before sitting down. His fingers hovered over the keys, then landed softly, like they'd been waiting for this moment their whole life. He didn't play Chopin this time. He played something simpler, something he'd written himself years ago, never shown to anyone. It was full of pauses and questions, of grief and small moments of light. When he finished, the room was quiet except for the ticking of a grandfather clock. The professor wiped his eyes. "You never lost it," he said. "You just carried it differently. That visit changed something. Not overnight, but steadily, like a river carving a new path." He started saying yes to small things. He let a local community center borrow his story for a youth mentorship campaign. No photos, just words. He agreed to meet with a few young musicians who'd seen the video and wanted to learn from someone who knew what music really meant. He didn't teach technique at first. He taught them how to listen, to the silence between notes, to the story inside a scale, to the courage it takes to be vulnerable through sound. Meanwhile, the Billionaire host reached out, not with cameras or contracts, but with a simple offer. "I'd like to help. Not as a spectacle, just however you need." He didn't ask for credit, didn't demand a documentary, just quietly arranged for a real piano to be delivered to the community center, where the man now spent his afternoons. A modest upright, well-tuned, with a bench that didn't creak. The first time he played it in front of the kids, they sat cross-legged on the floor, wide-eyed. One boy asked, "Did you really play for rich people in a fancy building?" He smiled faintly. "I played because I needed to remember who I was." And in that room, far from penthouse glitter, far from viral fame, he began to remember. Not as a prodigy, not as a janitor, just as a man who loved music and who finally felt safe enough to share it again. The world kept spinning. The video views plateaued. New trends took over the internet. But in that quiet corner of the city, something lasting was growing, not built on clicks or headlines, but on the simple act of showing up, opening your heart, and letting someone else hear the truth in your hands. The piano in the community center became more than an instrument. It became a kind of quiet promise. Every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, the man would arrive a little early, wipe down the keys with a soft cloth, and wait. Soon, kids started showing up too, not because they were forced to, but because something about the way he played made them feel like they belonged, even if they'd never touched a piano before. But while his afternoons filled with simple joy, his evenings grew complicated. One rainy Tuesday, a sleek black car pulled up outside the center. The billionaire from the penthouse stepped out, not in a tuxedo this time, but in a dark coat and jeans. looking more like someone trying to disappear than someone used to commanding rooms. He didn't bring cameras, didn't bring a team, just an umbrella and a folder. They sat at a small table in the back, away from the kids practicing scales on donated keyboards. The billionaire laid out his offer, a full concert tour, backed by top producers with venues already lined up in major cities. A documentary crew would follow, not to exploit, he insisted, but to tell the real story. People need to hear this, he said. Not just the music, but what it means to lose everything and still keep your soul. The man listened quietly, stirring his tea. He didn't say no right away. He'd be lying if he said the idea didn't stir something deep inside, the old dream still flickering after all these years. But he'd learned the hard way that dreams come with prices. What's in it for you? He finally asked. The billionaire hesitated. Honestly? Redemption. I made a joke of something sacred that night. I want to help make it right. It sounded sincere, but the man had seen enough of the world to know that even good intentions can get twisted when money and attention get involved. He'd read the fine print in his mind before it was even written. Interviews where he'd have to relive his brother's death. Photo shoots in tuxedos that didn't feel like him. Headlines calling him a miracle janitor, like his worth only mattered because of how far he'd fallen. I appreciate it, he said gently. But I'm not that person anymore, and I don't want to pretend I am. The billionaire nodded slowly. He hadn't expected an easy yes, but he hadn't expected such calm refusal either. What if we do it your way? He offered. No spotlight. Just support. You pick the venues, the message, the team. Still, the man shook his head. Music saved me when I had nothing. If I bring it back into the world, it has to be on its own terms, not as a story someone sells. That same week, the fiancée from the party showed up too, but not with offers or cameras. She came alone, wearing a simple sweater and carrying a notebook. She sat in the back during one of his sessions, watching how he guided a shy girl through her first piece, how he never raised his voice, how he smiled when she hit a wrong note and said, "That's how you learn, by getting lost first." Afterward, she approached him. "I'd like to learn," she said. "Not to perform, just to understand." He studied her for a moment, saw no pretense, just genuine curiosity. "Why?" he asked. "Because I spent my whole life treating music like furniture," she admitted, "something pretty to have in the background. But that night, I realized it's alive, and I missed it." He didn't say yes right away. But the next week she was back, with a beginner's book and quiet determination. She struggled with timing, fumbled chords, got frustrated easily, but she kept coming. And slowly something shifted, not just in her playing, but in how she listened. She started noticing the rhythm in rain on windows, the melody in subway breaks, the harmony in ordinary voices. Around the same time, another door opened. The retired Juilliard professor introduced him to a nonprofit that placed experienced musicians in underserved schools. They weren't looking for stars. They were looking for mentors, people who could show kids that art isn't just for the privileged, that beauty can grow in cracked sidewalks if someone waters it. The idea felt right. No stages, no spotlights, just a classroom, a keyboard, and a chance to pass on what almost died with him. But saying yes meant letting go of the safety he'd built. Teaching meant being seen, not as a curiosity, but as a person. It meant trusting that his past wouldn't define him, but could guide others. It meant risking disappointment, failure, even heartbreak. One evening, he sat alone in the community center after everyone had left. The streetlights cast long shadows across the floor. He placed his hands on the piano keys and played softly, not for anyone, just for himself. The piece was unfinished, full of questions. When he reached the end, he didn't know whether to close the lid or keep going. Then he remembered his brother's voice. Years ago. "You make the piano talk." Maybe it was time to let it speak again, not to crowds, but to kids who needed to hear that their voices mattered too. He made his decision the next morning. He called the nonprofit and said yes. He told the billionaire thanks, but no. He'd take the piano, but not the tour. And when the fiancée walked in for her lesson, he handed her a new piece of sheet music. "This one's harder," he said, "but I think you're ready." She smiled. Not the polished smile from the penthouse, but something real, uncertain, hopeful. And in that moment he realized he wasn't choosing between hiding and fame. He was choosing something quieter, deeper, a life where music wasn't a performance but a bridge, between past and future, between silence and sound, between one heart and another. The world might forget his name again, but in those classrooms, in those small moments of shared discovery, he'd be exactly where he was meant to be. Spring arrived quietly in the city, slipping in between rain showers and subway delays, painting fire escapes with new vines and turning cracked sidewalks into stages for dandelions. Inside a modest community center in Harlem, the air smelled of chalk dust, old books, and the faint sweetness of someone's leftover lunch. But what filled the room most was sound, real, imperfect, hopeful sound. Every Saturday morning, a small group of kids gathered around a well-loved upright piano, their fingers tentative but eager. Some came from crowded apartments with thin walls and noisy neighbors. Others had never seen a real piano up close until a few months ago. Now they argued good-naturedly over who got to play first, their voices full of the kind of excitement that can't be faked. At the center of it all sat the man who'd once played for Billionaires in silence. He didn't stand at the front like a conductor. He sat among them, sometimes on a folding chair, sometimes on the floor, listening more than he spoke. He didn't wear a suit or a title, just a soft sweater, worn shoes, and the quiet patience of someone who knew how long it takes for a seed to grow. One girl, 12 years old, with braids and a habit of chewing her pencil, had been especially shy at first. She'd sit in the back, arms crossed, watching everyone else play. "I'm not smart enough for this," she'd muttered the first day. "It's too fancy," he didn't argue. Just handed her a simple melody the next week, 3 notes, repeated, then expanded. "Try it," he said. "Not to be perfect, just to hear what your hands can do." She tried, missed, tried again, and slowly something unlocked, not just in her fingers but in her eyes. She started staying late, practicing when no one was watching. She'd hum the pieces on the bus home, tap rhythms on her lunch tray. Music became her secret language, one that didn't care about grades or what anyone thought of her. Months passed. Seasons turned. The man kept showing up, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. He'd turn down record deals, interview requests, even a standing invitation to play at a famous concert hall. None of it felt right, but this felt like coming home. The billionaire never showed up with cameras again. But every few weeks, a new keyboard would appear at the center, donated anonymously, always in perfect condition. Once a whole set of sheet music arrived, carefully selected for beginners. No note, no logo, just generosity without a price tag. The woman from the penthouse kept coming too. She wasn't a student anymore, more like a fellow traveler. She'd bring coffee, help organize sheet music, sometimes sit in the corner and play simple pieces while the kids worked. She'd stopped caring about how she sounded. Now she cared about how it felt, to lose yourself in a phrase, to find peace in a pause, to create something that didn't need to be perfect to be true. Then came the recital. It wasn't held in a grand hall with velvet seats and spotlights. It was in the center's multi-purpose room with folding chairs, a slightly wobbly mic, and a banner hand-painted by the kids. Our music, our voices. Parents filled the seats, some in work uniforms, some in Sunday best, all leaning forward with proud, nervous smiles. One by one, the students played. A boy who'd once been too restless to sit still now performed a gentle minuet with surprising focus. A teenager who barely spoke in class played a blues piece he'd written himself, full of raw feeling. And then, near the end, the 12-year-old with the braids walked to the piano. She'd chosen Chopin's Ballet No. 1, not the whole thing, of course, but a simplified version her teacher had carefully arranged just for her. It was still challenging, still full of emotion. As she sat down, her hands trembled slightly. She took a breath, just like she'd been taught, and began. It wasn't flawless. A few missed notes, a tempo that wavered. But none of that mattered. Because what filled the room wasn't perfection. It was courage. It was the sound of a child who'd been told she didn't belong, now claiming her place in the music. Her eyes stayed on the keys, but her heart was wide open. When she finished, the room didn't erupt in polite applause. It rose, parents, teachers, even the security guard who'd peeked in from the hallway. All on their feet, clapping not out of duty, but out of awe. Tears streamed down more than a few faces. The man watched from the back, arms crossed, throat tight. He didn't cry easily. But in that moment, he felt something deeper than pride. He felt continuity, Like a thread that had nearly snapped decades ago was now being woven into something new, something strong. Afterward, as people milled about, sharing cookies and stories, the girl found him. She didn't say much, just handed him a folded piece of paper. Inside was a drawing. 2 people at a piano, one tall, one small, with musical notes floating around them like fireflies. At the bottom she'd written, "Thank you for hearing me." He tucked it into his coat pocket, right next to the old photo of his brother. Later that evening, as he walked home under a sky streaked with sunset, the city felt different, not louder or brighter, but kinder. He passed a busker playing saxophone on the corner, a group of kids laughing over a shared earbud, an old man whistling a tune as he walked his dog. Music was everywhere. It always had been. He just hadn't let himself listen for a long time. He never became famous. Never toured the world. Never appeared on magazine covers. But in that community center, in those small classrooms, in the quiet moments between notes, he found something better. Purpose. Not as a prodigy, not as a symbol, but as a guide. Someone who helped others discover that their voices mattered, even if the world hadn't been listening. And that, he realized, was the real encore. Not applause from strangers, but the sound of a new generation finding their song. Not a marriage to a socialite, but a lifelong commitment to passing on the one thing that had never abandoned him. Music. In all its messy, human, healing glory. Back in his apartment that night, he sat by the window, the city humming below. He didn't need a grand piano. Didn't need a spotlight. He just needed to know that somewhere, a child was pressing a key for the first time, and feeling for the first time like they belonged.